Hello, Dr. Fluffy here. Today I'm starting a series of videos talking about the current war on biological sex and the concept of the gender binary.
First, we need to understand what we are. We are mammals and primates that reproduce sexually. And by definition, sexual reproduction entails trade of genetic information between two individuals of the opposite sex. In our particular case, and the case of the most mammal species, we are not just sexually binary, but we also have very accentuated sexual dimorphism, meaning we show differences in morphological and psychological characteristics besides just differences in sexual organs. While some other animals may have more easy to spot sexual dimorphism, like bigger differences in size, differences in colors, and even differences in structures made to attract the opposite sex, we humans show clear dimorphism since birth. If we discount primary sexual characteristics and secondary sexual characteristics that emerge during puberty, males are bigger and stronger than females. Females and male brain have shown to process information in different manners using different regions, showing clearly that innate psychological differences between male and female are biological. Even the psychological differences are marked in us since birth, as children as young as 9 months already show playing behavior in accordance with their binary categories. And I use the term categories now to avoid confusion because one of the weapons used in this discussion is confusion in terms and misrepresentation of what a term really means. So we have now established two things about our biology that are essential for this discussion. We are a binary species that needs two different sexes to reproduce, a male and a female. And those two categories are dimorphic, meaning they are different from one another both morphologically and psychologically. Another thing we already established is this difference is biological and have nothing to do with socialization. So this is innate in us since birth. So now let's talk about gender. First, let's define biological sex, the fundamental distinction found in most species of animals and plants based on the type of gametes produced by the individual, also the category to which the individual fits on the basis of that criterion, called. Then they refer to see gender identity and gender role because they're already making a distinction between gender and gender identity and gender role, but we'll talk about that later. Now let's see how biological sex definition says gender is just another name for biological sex. And for the most part, it is. But let's look at the definitions of gender itself. So we have the male or female or the state of being male or female. Very straightforward, nothing confusing about this. So it's female and male binary, totally binary. So let's look at another. This one still says only male and female, but it says that it's typically formed by social and cultural roles instead of biological features, but still only a binary. Now we are going to look at another one, and it says sex, then adds the behavior, cultural, and psychological traits associated with the sex. So again, binary and sex is the determining factor of gender. And when we look to another, members of one sex. More simple than that, it's impossible. So what is gender really? Well, when the word was created, it was just another word for sex. Not a scientific word for sex, but more in a social and cultural context. But since then, it has been kind of hijacked by radical activists. Remember those two words that we mentioned before, gender roles and they are coming up. But first, let's then define what gender is. Gender is then the result of your biological sex. It is how your biological sex interacts with society. Technically speaking, if you are a biological male, you are a man. And if you are a biological female, you are a woman. The names change, but they mean the same thing. So, in the end, gender is just how society sees the sexes. So, it's basically the same thing because a man needs a woman to reproduce. That is gender. Gender is all about your biology, your sex, but it's just the name that you use in society. There's no difference beyond that. Now, here is where the ideology comes in and starts poisoning definitions. For example, gender role is a common learned behavior in society that normally is specific for a gender and a sex. Now, currently, this more than ever doesn't fit every individual. Each person has its own personality, and in current society, humans have grown out of the typical gender roles. This is very important to understand. It's society that changes the cohesion of the gender role for a specific gender and not the opposite. So, it's society that is changing the behavior of the person, but it's not changing the gender. Let's look at an example. Some girls develop strong personalities due to male influences in their growth. Maybe they grew up playing with boys in the playground and became what we used to call tomboys. Maybe they're just naturally interested in more things that normally men are interested in. This is a variation of the typical gender role that is in our earlier years were more pronounced due to a higher natural selection pressure. Today, with the artificial society pressure, it's easier to deviate from typical gender roles, with biological limitations always constraining these deviations. But still, this does not create more than one gender or differentiate gender from sex. It just changes the perspective on the roles in society each of the two different genders play. Then we have gender identity. Let's look at this definition. A person's perspective of having a different gender, which may or may not correspond to their birth sex. Now, this definition shows how gender identity is not actually a thing. This term is born from the expectation of a condition called gender dysphoria that we are going to talk more in depth later on, maybe not in this video, but probably in the second part of this series. This condition makes patients with a brain dysfunction have their brain tell them they are not in the correct body, meaning they believe they are members of the opposite sex gender. This can cause serious discomfort and depression, with single treatment being the psychological counseling, hormonal treatment, and a sex change operation, making the external morphology of the subject match the brain perception of their sex. These are what we call transsexual people or transgender people, the real transgender people. This exception affects less than 0.3% of the human population, and this probably is an overestimated number, and you will understand why later on in this analysis. But is used to justify that a person's gender may not correspond to their biological sex. And still, we are only working in a binary, because it's a change between one gender to the other gender. But this notion is still incorrect, as more than 99% of people in the world do match their identity in sex and gender, making the exception just natural errors in biological function, as any biological system is prone to errors of various sources, but small errors with no statistical significance do not change definitions. Now that we understand the concepts in play, then why do we have people calling for the abolition of the concepts like biological sex, claims that are more than 74 genders, saying to use more than 30 new pronouns? Why do they claim they are victimized, and what do they use as evidence for their claims? Let's actually start with the last question. And the plain answer is they use others. Use others? What do you mean? They use two different groups of people with real natural conditions to justify their own ideological ambitions. First, they use intersex people. What is intersex, you ask? Well, it's errors in the productive phase where mutation or bad DNA recombination causes errors in the chains of DNA that can even cause an extra sexual chromosome to appear. They are very similar to what we call Down syndrome. They are just more rare than Down syndrome errors. They are not just very rare, but very different. They can occur in several forms with different errors, making them hard for doctors to deal with it, diagnose, and solve. Fortunately, it is very rare. 0.018% only of the human population is born with any of the many intersex conditions that we know so far. Many people, because of intersex, make false claims that sex is a spectrum, not understanding what is statistical relevance or even logic. Intersex people are not a different sex or gender. They are members of one of the two genders that have extra sexual characteristics from the other sex caused by an abnormality DNA formation with vestigial extra characteristics. While diagnosis can prove to be tricky, doctors attempt to match the correct gender and sex using organs that are fertile and that will allow the child to reproduce as the basis of diagnosis, as this is the more likely organ to represent the correct chromosomal gender and sex of the child. And other sexual characteristics are probably vestigial and unfertile. After diagnosis, hormonal treatment and the operation is performed to remove the extra organs. The problem is that these procedures sometimes are done before puberty. And because of the large variety of conditions that cause intersex variation, this procedure still is very prone to errors. But with the advances of molecular technology, using gene sequencing may help to improve identification of gender and reduce medical errors. So, last points to take in: intersex is not a third gender. It is just normal people from one of the two genders that were unfortunately born with birth defects and sexual characteristics they shouldn't have. Most just want to get their operation and resume their normal life, and many, if done properly, will grow up without even knowing that they have an extra chromosome or any intersex condition. So when a gender studies ideologue tries to tell you sex is a spectrum and intersex people are proof, you can say no. Point them to a biological book and tell them to study. So that's all for now. Sorry for the bad English because I'm still getting used to working with the mic and doing scripts. But next time we're going to discuss gender dysphoria and why do SJWs use these people to justify the non-binary theory. For now, please give a like, subscribe, share. It will help me out grow and improve in this YouTube thing. Because, one thing is to be a scientist, another is to communicate science in a way that can help out society to improve and fight this madness.
This is madness!
Not me!